With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Chav Dalid. We began the Braisa on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, where we have a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda regarding someone who asa'a labehema doifen l'sukkah. A person uses a living animal to serve as one wall or more for one sukkah. So Rabbi Meir poisel and Rabbi Yehuda machsher. And up until now on Daf Chav Gimel, we had a machlokes amoraim between Abaye and Abzeda as to what's the reason behind Rabbi Meir. They both understand that Rabbi Meir's invalidating that as a wall is a rabbinic invalidation, and Abaya understands that the reason why Rabbi Meir says that a living animal cannot serve as a wall, because the animal might die, Shema Tammuz, and if the animal will die, it's going to collapse, and it won't have the minimum height of 10 tfachim. With all of the pratim that we learned on Daf Chav Gimel, that indeed if it's a very large animal, like if it's an elephant, even if it turns into a carcass, it will still have the minimum height. According to Rabbi Meir, according to Abaya, it's going to be good. And Rabbi Yehuda, obviously, that holds that it's machsher, because Rabbi Yehuda doesn't take into account that remote possibility that punkt over sukkahs, the animal is going to die. In other words, whether you're chayish lemisa or not, according to Abaya, this is subject to the machlokes between Ameir and Rabbi Yehuda. Problem is, we no longer have a question on Abaya. But if that's the understanding of Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda in the machlokes regarding using an animal as a doifen for a sukkah, we have the braisa that we learned on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis regarding someone who buys wine from Kutim. And the way we learned until now, the machlokes between Rabbi Meir on one side and other Tanoim, including Rabbi Yehuda on the other side, is that Rabbi Meir allows for someone to make a verbal designation, and only after Shabbos, if that's going to be the case, then can you physically separate it. And what's the chiddush? That we're not chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid. We're not afraid that maybe the wineskin is going to burst and break. Rabbi Yehuda, who does not allow that verbal designation to happen, is because Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Shimon, they are chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid. And the Gemara until now was making this correlation because there is a link here. If you're chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid, that aligns with Shema Tammuz. If you don't take into account the possibility of Shema Tammuz, that's because it should be that you don't take into account the possibility that this wineskin is going to burst open, and now we have a contradiction. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir is chayish l'misa, but Rabbi Meir is not chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid. Rabbi Yehuda by the Braisa, who's machsher using a living animal for a doifen l'sukkah because he's not chayish l'misa. Rabbi Yehuda is chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid, and that's something that will have to be reconciled. Now, what we will have on Daf Chav Dalid is, again, we had this not that long ago, is another insight into the machlokes concerning buying wine from the Kutim, making this verbal declaration, which is linked to the question whether you subscribe to the principle known as Breira, retroactive clarification, as we'll speak out. That's something that we're going to review. And then finally, we're going to learn a third amoid on Daf Chav Daled, which will understand that when Rabbi Meir says that you may not use a living animal as a wall for a sukkah, the invalidation, not like Abaya, not like Rab Zera, is not a rabbinic invalidation, but it's a biblical invalidation. And that has to do with a new principle that we'll learn today. And the principle is that kol mechitza sho'im medes beruach, any partition that is only standing erect because it's filled with breath is not called a mechitza. And we will learn various understandings into this principle. Why would we say such a thing? On Daf Chav Daled Amud Beis, we're going to go back to the Braisa of Chav Gimel. We're going to quote the other Tana that addresses the question whether you may write a get on a living animal or not. And because of that, we will go and chazer. We're going to review various rules concerning the writing of a get. And on Daf Chav Daled Amud Beis, the Mishnah will begin by telling us regarding someone who built a sukkah bein ha'ilonos. In other words, the trees will serve as walls. This is not like the sugyas that we just learned regarding building a sukkah on top of a tree. Here the sukkah is built on the ground. Question is, can you use trees as walls for the sukkah, when don't forget there is an isur midrabanan not to make use of a tree on Shabbos, because Gezeira Shema Yiktzoir, how that will affect a sukkah that's built in between trees. And finally, very importantly, we're going to have on the Chavdalad Amud Beis the sugya known as Kol Mechitza She'ena Yechoila La'amid Beruach Mitzuya Eina Mechitza. That means if you built the mechitza that a usual wind will take apart the wall. Taking apart the wall doesn't only mean it's going to blow the wall down, but it's going to make the wall sway back and forwards, as it is common by many of these less expensive sukkahs, right? You have what became normal, the metal frame and the plastic white tarp walls, and they blow in the wind. That is going to be connected to the final sugi we will have on Af Chav Daled. Chavira, let's start on Af Chav Daled Amud Aleph. We left off 4 lines from the top of the Amid. The Gemara resolved the problem we had with Abaya by re-clarifying that when Abaya was reconciling the Mishnah and the Braisa regarding a Bas Kohen who married a Kohen, whether you do suspect that the husband passed away or whether or not we understand Abaya correctly. So the question is not going to be focused on Abaya, but as we spoke on in our introduction, however, Kashya that Rav Meir, Rav Meir says in Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph that Asa'a la behema doifim la sukkah, the sukkah is not kosher. Abaye explained why is it not kosher, because chayshin on shema tamus. In other words, you're chayish lemisa. Rabbi Meir in the Braisa that we learned regarding buying wine, let's say right before Shabbos, making the verbal declaration now is good. Why? Because after Shabbos you will physically separate it, and you're good. And we're not chayish l'shema yibaka hanoid. These two opinions appear to be in conflict one with the other. Says the Gemara, Amalach Rav Meir, the following. Misa, I think Tzvika pointed that out. You can't compare one with the other. Death is shchicha. Bikia sanoid is loy shchicha. Even physically, these wineskins, these containers, now unless something happened to it, just letting it be as it is, they last a lot longer than the life of an animal. Pashut. And furthermore, as the Gemara says, that efshir the masar leila shomer. What will make the wineskin burst open? Over this Shabbos. If it's going to fall, if someone is going to throw something on it, that's something that we are able to prevent. Like, for example, give it over to a guardian. He's going to make sure that nothing happens to the wineskin. Whether an animal is going to live or not, you can have 10 guardians. It doesn't help. Because the problem is that something within the animal can go wrong. And that cannot be protected. So there's a higher chance. What is amazing is, again, that normally we do know that Rabbi Meir is the Tana that holds that you're chayshin and lemeuta. Here we see that there are levels to the chayshin and lemeuta. No, Rabbi Meir takes into account the minority view, but even there's a limit. And if something is even less likely, because it's within our power to see to it that it won't happen, which is the breaking of this wine utensil, then Rav Meir doesn't have such a suspicion, and thus he allows making the verbal declaration right before Shabbos. Furthermore, the Gemara says, how do you resolve Kashya de Rabbi Yehuda ad Rabbi Yehuda? Again, if we'll understand that Rabbi Yehuda and Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, that says that you are allowed to use an animal as a wall for a sukkah, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that we're not chayish shema tamus. If we'll understand that in the Braisa of buying wine from the Kutim right before Shabbos, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda says that you may not make such a verbal declaration is because Gezeira Shema Yibaka Hanoid, and as we just spoke out, Shema Yibaka Hanoid is something even less likely, because there is something we can prevent it from happening over Shabbos. So how do you reconcile that? So Gemara explains that really, Talmud Rabbi Yehuda lav mishum the chayish l'bekiyas hanoid. The real reason why Rabbi Yehuda, and that goes to Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Shimon, they argue with Rav Meir, why Ella Mishum Delays Lei Bereira. They do not subscribe to this whole principle of retroactive clarification. In other words, there's 2 steps here, very important to clarify. When a person who bought this untithed wine, and he makes a declaration that eventually 2 loig will be truma, and the 9 loig is going to be meiser rishon, and the 8 loig is going to be meiser sheni. That declaration, if you will never end up fulfilling your stipulation, That happens if, for example, the wineskin breaks. If you never fulfill your stipulation, so the entire verbal declaration becomes meaningless, and what is right now in the wineskin is tevel. Now, if you will fulfill your stipulation after Shabbos, you'll fulfill it because you can guard the wineskin and it did not break. No one is going to say that your verbal declaration is meaningless. It's meaningful. What is the contents in the barrel is not tevel, but there is some truma and some chulin. And when you will drink wine over Shabbos, maybe you will drink the truma part. Just to make that clear. If you subscribe to Bereira, to retroactive clarification, then we say that after you separate the Truma and the Meiser, that retroactively clarified that which you separated was the Truma and everything else is Chulin, which means that Lemafreya, what you consumed over Shabbos, was bonafide Chulin. If you don't subscribe to Bereira, it's not that we're saying that the declaration has no value. It has a lot of value. Prior to declaration, everything was tevel. Your declaration, taka, separated trumas. Now, in the barrel, there are some truma, some chulin. But when you are drinking out of this barrel on Shabbos, who told you that you're drinking from the chulin? You are drinking from the truma. Gavaldik. Says the Gemara, hold on, is this not the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? When the Braisa records Rabbi Yehuda saying so to Rav Meir, Sefer of that Braisa, that Amru was in plural, because I know we're just focusing on Rabbi Yehuda, but really it's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon, that all of them told Rav Meir, how can you allow such a solution? Maybe the noid is going to burst. And again, if the noid bursts, it's not only, forget about Bereira, if you will never end up fulfilling your stipulation of at some point separating physically, removing the truma, then the verbal declaration is meaningless altogether. Then everything there is tevel. And Avmeir responded to the three Tanoim, listen, if such a thing were to happen, you're right. But we don't have to take that into account. The Amar Rav Meir tells them, if that will happen, you're right, but I'm not concerned that it's going to happen. So all this is part of the kash. So Machlal, don't we see from that back and forth that Rabbi Yehuda is chayish lebekiyas hanoid, and it's not about Bereira? So answers the Gemara, no. I will tell you that the reason why Rabbi Yehuda argues with Rav Meir is because Rav Meir does not subscribe to Bereira. And even though your verbal declaration is okay, and even if you'll end up separating the Trumas Umaisris, doesn't matter. What you consumed over Shabbos could have been part Truma. It could have been part Maiserishin. Doesn't belong to you. And by Truma it's much worse. Hassan Rabbi Yehuda hu de Ka'amel Rav Meir. This is what he's really telling him. Lididi leisli bereira. So the sole concept of doing an action later and that retroactively clarifying, I b'chlal don't subscribe to that. But according to you, Rabbi Meir, you do subscribe to Bereira. But and for that, okay. So now again, we not only resolved the stira, the problem with Abaya, but now also we reconciled the shitos of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Bottom line is, we're still standing with one of the opinions. There was Rab Zera that we're not focusing on, but Abaya, who explains that Shitas Rabbi Meir regarding using a living animal, doifel no Sukah, that Rab Meir says it's invalid because Rab Meir holds Shema Tamus, and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't have such a suspicion, which is why he says that it's kosher. Frag the Gemara, v'loi chayish Rabbi Yehuda lemisa. How did we begin the first Mishnah of Yuma? Aside of everyone's opinion that you have to have a backup Kohen Gadol, just in case the current Kohen Gadol will become invalid, when he will become unqualified, when he will become tamei, or other invalidations, and everyone agrees to that. But on that, says Rebbe Yehuda, aside of having a backup Kohen Gadol, you have to have a backup wife with all of the details, when he marries her, what happens with the first wife. You can only have one bias. It was a very beautiful Gemara there. And Rabbi Yehuda says, Af isha cheres maskinaloi, shema tamus ishtoi. Doesn't that directly contradict our Rabbi Yehuda, the way Abai explains it, that holds that there's no cheshasha of Shema Tamus. Here, Dafka, he's chayish that the wife will pass away. So for that, the Gemara says, you're right, but don't put all of the halachas of Torah here on the same track. Generally, Rabbi Yehuda is not chayish lemisa. Everything fits. Rab Meir is the one that's chayish lemauta. That's why everything fits. He's chayish lemisa. What's in Yuma? We learned that a higher standard was made regarding kapara, which is exactly what Yom Kippur is all about. So even though Rabbi Yehuda generally is not chayish, here he is chayish. It's a very small possibility. We don't have to, in other areas of halacha, take it into account, but to make sure that if such a thing were to happen, we're not stuck, and therefore we would lose some level of kapara on Yom Kippur. So we got to adhere to a higher standard. All right. Now says the Gemara, Bein lamanda amar shema tammuz. Sai, according to the explanation of Abaye, let's not forget, Rab Zera gave his other explanation of this machlokes, but the commonality between Abaye and Rab Zera's interpretation of the machlokes is that even Rabbi Meir, who passes, he only passes it midrabanan, it's Zera. In other words, midoiraisa mechitza ma'aliyahi. It's really a good mechitz. It's only the Rabbanon that make a decree. Let's not forget that on Daf Chav Gimel, even though the Braisa began discussing using an animal as a partition for a sukkah, the Braisa then added other halachas. The Braisa added regarding Rav Meir, that you can't use it as a lechi law to a mavoi, that you can't use it for pasibarois, and then you cannot use it for a goyla lekever. Now that will be a problem. Why would Rav Meir say that if someone had a coffin, let's teach that goyel means a tomb covering as a partition, and there is a halacha midoiraisa that a tomb covering acquires mamish tumas meis, and it can so contaminate all other things that are susceptible to becoming tami b'tumas meis. If you're telling me that on a biblical level it's considered a partition, so then tetami mishum goyel. And alama tanan, it's interesting over here that even though we learned in the Braisa, Rav Meir writing the words that it's not netame mishum goyel, the Gemara is quoting here a Mishnah. We learned in the Mishnah the same thing. We learned in the Mishnah in Eruvin that the Rabbi Yehuda, which by the way holds mitame mishum goyel, and Rav Meir mitayer. Now we got ourselves a problem. Why would Rav Meir be mitayer? The Chachamim, again, they can be machmer. They can put a fence around the Torah. They can't take away a tumah midoiraisa. How are they doing that? This is skavaldik. So, and because of that, the Gemara doesn't answer this. In other words, we basically now are refuting both Abaye and Rab Zera. You can't explain the Braisa on Daf Chav Gimel that the problem that Rav Meir has with using a living animal as a partition is only a rabbinic issue. It must be a biblical issue. And only that will explain why, therefore, it's also used lekula, that if you used an animal as a goyla lekever, that it won't give off the tumas goyla. And indeed, Elo Amar Ravacha Bar Yaakov, Kosava Rabbi Meir. Now listen to this gavaldik logic. Kol mechitza shoy medes beruach. Any partition that is only standing erect because of breath, and here in our case is because the animal is breathing. So what is really creating the mechitza? Now I know that the breath in the animal, right, is in the animal. The animal is, flesh and meat and bones, but it's breath that's keeping the animal erect. Breath is a non-tangible. Breath is a non-tangible. So therefore you can't use an animal as a mechitza because you don't really have yourself a mechitza. And that invalidation is a biblical invalidation. Kol mechitza sho'imedes beruach, simply because it's only standing because of ruach, al yidei ruach, is not called a mechitza. Another way of wording the same concept, but it's different. Ikada Amri, that Omar Ravacha Bar Yaakov, Kosova Rabbi Meir holds that Kol Mechitza she'ena asuya bidei adam eina mechitza. Oh, another nuance, that the fact that the partition, the fact that the life force in the animal is not man-made. It's not about breath being untangible, but it's about, is it man-made? It's not man-made. And by the way, it sounds almost like Shema Tammuz, but it's much more than that. Since you were not the one that put the soul into the animal, it's not within your ability to do so, so therefore it's not called a mechitza. What's the difference whether you emphasize on the fact that the breath is not tangible, or whether you emphasize that a life force that's not man-made cannot be used for a mechitza? Huge. Today you have balloons, and then they would blow air into a wineskin or other types of kalim. What happens if we blew into a certain shell and it inflated? Can you use that for a mechitza? According to the first version of Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, no, you can't, because if that which is making, let's say, the balloon stand erect is breath, I don't care that you were the one that did it. Breath is a non-tangible. If the issue is dafka concerning the life of an animal because the life force is not man-made, then in the case where you blew up something, that will be considered a valid partition. As the Gemara says, that my benayu, the second to last line on the Amid, ike benayu, the oikma benoi tafuach, that if you created the wall by blowing up a wineskin, the man the amar mechitza, that's oimedes beruach, is eino mechitza, as we explained, because since breath is intangible, you can't count it as a mechitza, even though it's holding up something that is tangible. So then, hare oimedes beruach, I don't care that you were the one that blew up the balloon, still it's oimedes beruach, so it's invalid. But Laman, the Amar, according to the second version, that the explanation that Rav Acha gave him, Rab Meir, why biblically a animal is not good, because it's eina asuya b'dei adam, because life force is not man-made. Oh, so that's only concerning a living being. Daf chav daled amud beis. Harei, this noid or any other, today a balloon, is asuya b'dei adam, and yes, man was the one that introduced the air into it. Man-made is okay. Ruach is intangible, I don't care, because the Ruach is not in the air, the Ruach is inside something. This is a Gavaldika, two versions, B'shitas Rav Acha. Okay, and with that, we concluded the explanation of the Braisa and Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph that spoke about using a living animal as a wall, and now we're going to go to the end of that Braisa, that the final thing the Braisa said is Mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that you also cannot use a living animal to write on it a document of a get, a divorce document. And the question will be, why is that? Amar Mar, the master of the Braisa, taught us above that Mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili Yomru, that ein koisvin olav gitei nashim. Says the Gemara, my time that Rabbi Yossi Aglili, why would that be? We're going to go now to Gitin. The Tanya we learned in a Braisa. We're focusing on a pasuk that we have on Parshas Kiseisei that writes v'chosav lo sefer krisus v'nosan biyada. Says the Braisa that the word sefer implies that the surface upon which you're writing the get is a sefer. How do you teach a sefer? The narrow definition of a sefer is a parchment. Today you would say a paper, but that's it. So ainli ela sefer. It has to be a parchment document. It doesn't exclude paper. To write on that which you would write books out of. And not what? And from that word, you would say that you cannot write a get on a wooden tablet. And the other machlokes that we're not addressing directly, can you write it on food? Rashi brings both of these because that's really the sugi over there. And sefer l'chu'ura would exclude both. It has to be on a sefer, meaning on a document, on a paper or on a parchment. However, minayin l'rabbeis kol davar. This Tanach ascribes that you are allowed to write a get on a wooden tablet. You are allowed to write it, like Rashi says, on a leaf of an olive tree or other food items. Oh, so Talmud Loimer says the Tana, since it says v'kosav lo, and the Torah could have written, guys listen, the Torah could have written that v'nosan biyada sefer krisus, would have been clear, that he should place in her hand a document of separation. The words v'kosav lo are mamish extra. So says the Tana that sefer is it's a limit. You can only write it on a sefer. But to add to that, you take the Kosav law, and it tells you that Mikol Makam, you can write it on anything. Well, if you can write it on anything, Imkei Ma Talmud Loimer Sefer. Sefer does mean, let's say, a parchment document. Today you would say a paper document. Because we still do exclude. What do we exclude? Loimer Loch Ma Sefer Davar She'ein Bei Ruach Hayim. Sefer is something that's not alive. And according to this Tana, Ve'ein oichel, again, that's not going to be the focus. So, af kol davar she'ein bei ruach hayim ve'ein oichel. So, therefore, you would be allowed to write it on a wooden board, and you would be allowed to write it on a leaf of an olive tree that's not oichel. But you cannot write it not on a living thing and not on oichel, and that is the source of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Now, the Rabbanan of that Beraisa, they validate you writing a get both on food and on a living animal. Problem is, again, it was a great limud. We had the word sefer, and then we had the word v'chasav law that expounds upon it, that expands it. So v'rabanan I kasav ba sefer, as Rashi says 4 lines from the top. If the Torah would have written v'kasav law krisus ba sefer, then the word ba sefer would have meant on a parchment document, and then you have the right to say that the words v'kasav law to begin with is extra, so it adds to not only on a parchment document but on kol davar kedekodamart. But now that it says sefer, not ba sefer, but sefer, to begin with, sefer is not speaking about on what you write it, but sefer is describing what needs to be written. And this is what we quote in the Bar Mitzvah Maimer. This is mamish the opening of Sefer Yetzirah regarding the word Sfiras. What does sefer mean? So sefer also means sipur. In other words, l'sfiras devarim ba'alma, that what the Torah is telling you, that what affects the severance, the narration, there has to be words that share the story, the narrative that this man is being koides his wife. So if basefer is not b'chlal referring to upon which your whole base goes away. Once we began, there's basefer, so that already begins. You have to write it on parchment, and then you have a v'chasav law. You built upon it. No, the whole basefer is not speaking upon which, it's telling you what needs to be done, that the way a man divorces his wife is by recording a narrative of severance. Now, v'rabanan, hi v'kasav my dar shubah. Okay, very good. But don't forget that we pointed out very well, the Torah could have written the nasan biyada sefer krisus. And taich very good. Sefer krisus means, again, a narration of severance. The words v'kasav law are extra. Says the Gemara, Omi boyalei, another din. And that is that only b'chsiva mizgareshes ve'ena mizgareshes b'kesev. That what will affect a divorce, only a written document, and not giving her money. Why would you think that giving a woman money, one's wife, that should affect the get? Makes a lot of sense. Because as we will learn so many dinim, that the Torah writes v'yotza v'hoisa, that she leaves, and then she will become someone else's wife in the parsha of Kiseitze. And from that Chazal, because of that juxtaposition, they learn many dinim, in which we do compare the marriage to the divorce. And we begin Kiddushin by learning, right, Kesef Minolan, that one of the 3 ways that we affect Kiddushin is the first one the Mishnah mentions is by Kesef. So one would have thought, Ma Havaya, just like to affect the becoming, the marriage, is Bekesef, maybe it's here Bekesef. So the Torah needs to write the words V'kasav law to exclude any other medium. It has to be something that's written. Now, but Rabbi Yossi Aglili, how does he know that a get is only effective if you are writing a document? Don't forget, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the words V'kasav law is not coming to teach you that it's only through writing and not by something else. The word v'kasav law is to add to the items upon which, if, let's say, you will choose to write it, it doesn't only have to be ba sefer. So answers the Gemara me sefer krisus. The word krisus, it's a document of severance. In other words, we're learning like there's like a hekesh. Sefer krisus, So we say that the kirisus only happens through the sefer. It's from the juxtaposition of these two words together. Sefer korsa ve'ein davar acher kors. Now ve'idach, they don't need to learn from this juxtaposition, this din of sefer korsa ve'ein davar acher korsa, because they learn it from the vekasavla. So what do they learn from this hekesh? Ahomi bayale, that ledavar akoyres beinoy lebeino. That when a man is writing a get to his wife, it has to be something that creates a complete, absolute severance. And not what? Not that the man should have the ability of writing some sort of stipulation in the get that will always keep her bound to that stipulation, indirectly always keeping her bound to him. And Kidatanya, we learned in a Braisa, and guys, Bachlal, nowadays, if there is a divorce, no stipulations are ever added to it. Like nowadays, when a man affects Kedushin, no stipulation are used, but according to Halacha, you could make a Tanai in the Kedushin, and you can make a Tanai in the Gittin. But there are limits to the Tanai and the Get. And here goes the Brais. If a man tells his ex-wife to be, on the condition that you will never drink wine, which means that for the rest of her life, she's bound by that stipulation, that means that the Sefer was not koides completely. Or you may never visit your father, or any other stipulation that will keep her bound forever. That ein ze krisus. However, kol shloishim yoim. If a man makes these two conditions or any other condition, but he says it's only for 30 days, then harei ze krisus, by the way, it's koides immediately. And that is learned, according to the Chachamim, from the juxtaposition of Sefer Krisus. Now, Ve'idach, meaning Rabbi Yossi Haglili, how does he learn this din? So says the Gemara, Mikodes Krisus Nafke, the Torah could have written Sefer Kodes, and from the Sefer Krisus, he has now room to learn the two dinim. And Ve'idach and the Chachamim, Kodes Krisus Loi Darshe. Okay, Atkan. Moving on to the next din in Sukah. Says the Mishnah. Unlike the issue of building a sukkah on top of a tree. And as we learned, midrabanan, you may not climb on a tree. You may not be mishtamish be'ilan. And the whole issue of whether the sukkah is good for chalamoyed, we learned Rashi in the Mishnah. If you go on it and you violated the drabanan, will you be yoyt to the mitzvah doirais and all of that? Now we're learning a whole new case. No, you are using the trunk of a tree to serve as a wall to the sukkah. The hoyelon is the fanisla. So here says the Mishnah, you have absolutely no problem. All right, ksheda. And guys, if you remember, we learned in all of those interesting scenarios in the Mishnah that if you build the sukkah in a way where it's leaning against the trees, right? And if you were to remove the trees, the schach were to collapse, that's a much bigger problem. Here again, Rashi emphasizes, you don't need, the trees are only serving as walls and not as a support to the schach. So the Mishnah writes that it's kosher. Now, Omar Avacha by Yaakov, and we're going to come back to our Mishnah, he gave the following rule, that kol mechitza she'eni yochaylu la'amid beruach mitzuya, if you have a partition that is unable to stand up against even a usual wind, says Rav Acha eino mechitza. It's not halachically called a partition, meaning not only if a usual wind will make the wall fall down, even if it's going to stand, but it's going to sway to and fro, and swaying to and fro, technically, let's go in halacha, that if it's going to move a tefach to both sides, a tefach here and a tefach back, it's b'chatchila not called a mechitz. And now the problem is, how can Avacha make such a statement? L'cha'ura, if you're using trees as the walls of a sukkah, are we not also speaking about saplings, smaller trees, or using the sometimes the branches of trees that will sway to and fro through the wind? Doesn't it say in our Mishnah, asks the Gemara, Tanan ha'isa sukasi beinu ilanois, and v'ilanois the fanis law, the Mishnah says ksheda. And how can you, but why? V'haka'azal v'asi. It will, trees will sway with the wind. So Rav Acha will limit the case of the Mishnah. Now, obviously, guys, if you have these huge trees and the part that you are using for the wall is the solid trunk, then what we're saying now is not needed. But what Rav Acha is adding, forget the caution. Exactly, that we're speaking about the trees are large, and the hard trunk is that which is being used for the walls, and it does not move back and forth. But what about if you are using the branches, and the branches will swing back and forth? So even if you use the branches, the avid lebo hutzavadafno, that you will weave the branches together with palm branches and the like, and when you do that, you fortified, you so to say fixed the branches that it should be sturdier. Again, the technical is you don't want it to go in either direction, a tefach or more. Says the Gemara, no, there's a chiddush here. The tema that nigzor dilma asilish tamushe be'ilan. The issue is that true, you don't need these trees as a support for your schach. You're certainly not building it on top of a tree. But if you're going to have as a wall, you're going to have a tree. You might end up leaning on a tree on Shabbos is asan midrabanan. Any type of direct usage of a tree is asan midrabanan. Even tzideim. Right, the heter is only tzideim. So maybe the Chazal would have made a takana that you can't use it as walls for Yom Tiv. So Kamash Malan that we make no such gezeiram. Says the Gemara Tashema, get another attempted question, refutation against Rav Acha bar Yaakov. It says in a Braisa, Haya Shamilan, they were speaking about again the Pasei Bira'is, the wells that were built on the way going from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, affording the Yidden that are doing the mitzvah of Aliyah L'regel, for them being able simply to pull over to the side of the road and spending Shabbos there and having all of the water that they need for their animals and themselves, and the issue of how can you take water out of a well if the well is 4x4 and it goes down 10 tfachim, it's about a fight of the the areas around it is minimally is considered a Carmelis, and the solution that they gave is the most lenient type of mechitzas ever, and that is you have these right angle boards that only go out in either side one amma. They're called pasei bira'os, the oimdim, double. So you have 4, which is really 8. And you are allowed, as long as the area in between the open area, I think again is 16.6. That's what I remember, Amos. In other words, there's a substantial amount of space that you can have in between them. And everything in there is considered a Rishus HaYachid. And furthermore, says the Braisa, you don't have to put yourself these Pasei Bira'os. If there is already a natural Mechitza, it could be incorporated and used as part of the Pasei Bira'os. So for example, if you have a tree, or if you already have a pre-built fence, or if you have a Mechitza of Kanim, a wall of reeds, so Nidain Mishum Diyoimit, you can use it as a Diyam now with all of the details, right? It has to go an Amma, but to use that which is already there. And the question is, one of the things that the Brais allows to be used is a tree, because it's considered a partition. If you, Rav Acha bar Yaakov, are telling me that any mechitza that is unable to stand erect without swaying to and fro by a regular wind is b'chlal not called a mechitza, how can such a ilan be used? So there also the Gemara says, either we're speaking about a tree, I mean the Gemara doesn't have to say it, because the Braisa doesn't limit you to only being allowed to use the cushion, like in our Mishnah. It's a categorical statement. It must mean the trunk, it must mean the leaves, it must mean the branches, yeah, even by the branches, as long as the Avid Lei B'chutz V'dafno. And now the Gemara is going to have a real strong question on this, because this way out of making Chutz V'dafno L'cha'ura won't work for the following Braisa. Tashema, it says in another Braisa, now there we're speaking about, again, Shabbos carrying, you are out there in the field, and there is this huge tree whose leaves and branches really surround the tree, and they droop down. So says the Braisa that Ilan HaMeisech HaLa'aretz, there's a natural canopy. In other words, it's coming all the way down. Now we know the din of lavud. It doesn't have to touch the ground, but it has to come within 3 tvachim from the ground. Im ein noifa gevei menaretz. If the edges of these branches are not above the ground, 3 tvachim, it's within 3 tvachim. So now you have yourself a proper partition. So we are allowed to view the area under the tree as a sectioned off Rishus HaYachid mitaltel and tachtov. And here again we have a kashan. Why? To make it a Rishus HaYachid, you have to have a midrabanan l'kul ha'alma 4 mechitzas. If you're telling me that anything that is swaying back and forth, here we're not using the trunk, here we're using the branches. So if you're using those branches, aren't they moving with the wind? So here, but we already know the answer. Yeah, and indeed, the Braisa must mean, ayamai ha'ka'azi v'asal. So are you going to tell me, Hasam Nami, the Ovid Label Hutzav Dafna? Yeah, the Mishnah Baraisa only means you can use it if prior to Shabbos you wove into the edges and to the ends of these branches palm leaves or other materials that secure this canopy, this natural canopy, to its place, that it should not blow, it should not sway to and fro. Here it's a lot more problematic. And why is it here a lot more problematic? Second to last line, Ihachi, this is my kasha. We should be allowed to carry under this canopy no matter how large the canopy is. And who said otherwise? Allama Amar Afuna Bereid Rabbi Yeshua Ein Metaltalin Boy Daf Chafei Ela Beis Sosayim Chevre. Let's chazer something we have in Shabbos and in Eruvin, and that is that if you have yourself a proper Rishus HaYachid, if you have for yourself an area that is enclosed for people to live in, Shehu Kaf Ladira, there is no limit to how large the inner Rishus HaYachid is, you are fully allowed to carry in there. But there is a rule that if you have an area that's not made, it's not Hukaf Ladira, it wasn't sectioned or for you to live in it, Midrabanan, if it's Beis Sosayim, which is, if you remember, 5,000 square amas, midrabanan, it goes back to having the din of a Carmelis, and Rav Huna, Bereid Rabbi Yeshua, linked this din to the case of the natural canopy. Now this must be this humongous tree, which fine. Now hold on, if nothing was done, there was no human intervention, no weaving was done to affix the branches, that I got. So you can say that the area under the canopy was loy hukaf ledira. But if you're going to have to limit the case of the Baraisa, as we did up until now, for sure, you can only use it if you affixed it, if you made it stronger. It should not sway with the wind. If you were the one that invested koyach to, so to say, weave the edges of the branches together, affixing them a lot better, so then you made your effort. And what's your goal? You were traveling, you want to spend Shabbos underneath the canopy, and you don't want to be bound with the laws of carrying. Well, if you did it to live underneath it, then why should there be any such limitation? And answers the Gemara that if you remember the dinim of hukaf ladira or loy hukaf ladira, karpav shaloy hukaf ladira, there is another din. And that is that even if you built a partition for people to be in it, but it's primarily for people to have that place, for them to be better shoymrim for the areas outside of it. And that's called dira shetashmisheha la'avir, a dwelling whose primary usage is for the open air that's outside of it. And what the Gemara is really saying is that if you're traveling out of Shabbos and you find this beautiful large tree, and if you were the one that with the Hutza and Dafna, you affixed the mechitzas that it should not sway to and fro in order for you to spend Shabbos underneath it, for that Rav Huna Bereid Rabbi Yeshua made no such limitation. What was he speaking about? That you came to this natural tree and this natural canopy where prior to you arriving here, the branches that were creating the canopy were already affixed. Now, why would a person b'chlal affix such a canopy? So, because when you have fields and you need to have people that stand guard for what? For the produce in the fields. Animals or people should not come, take and steal it, etc. In other words, then a shomer cannot stand open under the sun the whole day. So you want him to have a protected area, but he's not there to live in it. He's there to guard that which is outside of it. And here we also have this rabbinic limitation that if you have a dira whose primary function is la'aviris for the open space area outside of it, and only there did Rav Huna Bereid Rabbi Yeshua put the limitation. Now so it's already a little bit more of a doichik. In other words, what we are saying is that you can spend Shabbos underneath it only if the branches were fixed, and if effort was not made, then beruach mitsuya, it's going to sway back and forward. And on the other hand, it was not made for you to be shoyves there. If it was made for you to be shoyves there, there's no such limitation. It was made prior. If it was made prior, then you have to presume it was made for it to be used as some sort of guardian hut. And that's why, yes, we put the limitation, the rabbinic limitation, that you can only carry, that if it's larger than Beis Osayim, or Beis Osayim and larger, then you no longer can carry underneath it. And let's go to the...
On that, Rabbi, if you had a hut out in the field, nothing to do with a tree, but a man-made, nice hut, it can't be bigger than Beis Osayim because it's there to service the field. That's what we're learning.
That's correct. That's correct. But guys, don't forget, Beis Osayim is 5,000 square amos. That's a very large hut. This scenario is very rare.
Yeah, and that would be a very large tree.
That would be a very good, very large tree. But we have to address it because Rabbi Yeshua addressed that. Okay, let's final one. Tashema. Again, this is an attempted refutation against Rav Achar Bar Yaakov. It says in a Braisa. Here again, Shabbos B'Teil, you're traveling, and you're going to spend Shabbos out there. And normally, the halacha will be that you can't carry. What happens if there is a mound? And then, we learned the details. It has to be on an incline that over 4 amas. It goes up 10 tfachim. We consider the walls, so to say, around the mound to be bona fide mechitzas. And indeed, now, how large is the area on top of the mound? If the area is less than 4 amas, then it's irrelevant. Once it's a very small mound, you can carry on that, not because you are in a Reshus HaYachid, because b'toich dalad amas, you don't have an issue. So it's dalad amas, again, up until Beis Osayim. Again, more than Beis Osayim. Even though it's surrounded by this natural mechitza, it's called a karpav, and midrabanan, you're no longer allowed to carry. But if it's within that limitation, and similarly, if instead of it being a mound, if it goes into the ground, v'chein ben neka, if you have a cleft in the ground, shuhu amoik, again, it has to have halachic partitions, meaning that the walls going down are 10 tfachim, and again, it's from arba amas until Beis Osayim. And here comes the final case, v'chein kama. Ketsura. So a person has this beautiful grain field, and someone began to reap, to harvest the field. And you have until now, you have these circles in the fields, made by the aliens. Who knows? You have these circles. So in there, if you're inside such a circle, so you're in a cleared area, but around you, you're surrounded by the standing stalks. And they're 10 tfachim or higher. So we view that area as a Reshus HaYachid, and therefore not only are you allowed to carry within it, but here we're focusing on the tchum that you can only walk, forget about carrying, you can only walk outside the place of your residence 2,000 amma, up until 2,000 amma. Question is, what's considered the place of your residence? So if you take out Shabbos in the open field, you only are given dalad amas. And you have to start counting the 2,000 amma from right out. You really have 2,004 amas, if you remember. But since this is considered the natural, so to say, the Reshus HaYachid, so you get to only start measuring the 2,000 amas outside of this area. So mahalach eskula v'chutzala alpayim amma. Here again, why are you allowed to view the area inside as a Reshus HaYachid? Because you are relying on the mechitzas. Now, when you have a mound or you have a cleft, the wind doesn't move the earth. It's not swaying back and forth. But the third case that the Braisa gave was just a beautiful, you're in middle of a field, that you are in the area that was already harvested, and then right around you, you're surrounded by standing stalks. But don't they move with the wind? And here again, we have to say that the Ovid Leibo Hutzavadafna, that has to be fixed in a way. Just practically, if you weave the innermost standing stalks with hutzah and daphne or any other type of natural materials, which is just an example of what people would have used. You can use ropes, doesn't matter what you use. The vart is that we are standing with the din of Rav Achar Bar Yaakov, that if you have a partition that is swaying to and fro, it's not called a partition. And this is the biggest challenge that people have with what we call with the tarp sukkahs. I'm not saying that the tarp cannot be fixed. The tarp could be fixed. But if you notice that many people are not going to rely on their fixing of the tarp because of this din of Rav Achar Bar Yaakov. And what will they do? They'll use a solution, as we keep on learning, the solution of lavud. They build another mechitza, and they're not going to be using a lattice, even if the strings or the ropes are going to be going only in one direction, I think the most common thing that I saw is that people put the skinniest of string, but that does not move with the wind, right under 3 tfachim from the ground. Then they put another string which is less than 3 tfachim above the first one. In other words, they go up until 10 tfachim. As long as each rope, each string, or any other material, adarabah, you can use a little skinny board, is within 3 tfachim one with the other. So we use the din of lavud, and you created for yourself proper mechitzas that are not swaying with the wind. That is something that many people witnessed, to go and to make sure that you're not relying on a wall that is swaying to and fro. On the other hand, to make it clear, no one is being moitzi laz. You have so many fruma yidden that use the tarp sukkahs, but all of them make an effort that it should be fixed. And again, if it blows a little bit, it's not the end of the world. We're looking that it should not go a tefach in either direction. God willing, to be continued.